Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Opening Traps That Every Beginner Should Know. In this episode, episode 3, we're going to cover the Ruy Lopez, and we're actually going to look at 3 common traps in the Ruy Lopez in this video. So do stay tuned for all 3. I especially like the third one, the Tarrasch Trap, because I've seen a number of strong players fall for that one in the past. As always, if you're new to the channel, do hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down below to let me know any content that you'd like to see in the future. So to play the Ruy Lopez, white kicks things off with pawn to e4. We then have e5 by black, knight f3, knight c6 and bishop b5, starting the Ruy Lopez, also known as the Spanish game. The most common reply from black here is pawn to a6. Now white can capture and take on e5, and this is known as the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez, but this is only a temporary win of a pawn, and black will soon be able to regain the e4 pawn, and it's just a completely different game basically. So the most common way for white to play here is to drop the bishop back and preserve it. And the first line we'll look at is known as the Noah's Ark Trap. So here black plays pawn to d6. Now this is a bit of a passive move to defend the centre like this without first developing a bishop or a knight. And in response to this, white can now break immediately in the centre with pawn to d4. So black now plays pawn to b5 to break this pin because white was threatening to go d5 with his pawn and win a piece. White drops the bishop back to b3. Black now takes on d4 with the knight. White chops back. Black takes with the e-pawn. And this is where black has now set a trap for white. If white jumps in here and takes with the queen to win a pawn in the centre, black now has the pawn push, pawn to c5, hitting the white queen and picking up an important tempo. White jumps into d5 to threaten checkmate on f7, also hitting the rook on a8, and so the only way for black to defend both of these threats is to play bishop out to e6. And now white sees the fact that as soon as the queen moves away, the pawn will push and trap the bishop, so white throws in the check, but now black simply blocks with the dark squared bishop, and not only is it blocking the check, but the queen now defends the rook on a8, so there's no issues there. White comes back, threatening checkmate again, but now instead of repeating the position with a bishop block, we simply trap the bishop, and black is winning a piece. So coming back here, how should you play against this if you're not going to capture the pawn? Well, there's no need to even push the d4 break in the first place, but if that's the way in which you have played, then you can simply play pawn to a4 in this position, already starting to undermine this light squared pawn chain, and making it more difficult for black to simply push c5. The other alternative here is that instead of playing d4 in this position, you instead play something like c3 to prepare d4 and allow you to capture back with the pawn and keep that strong pawn centre. You also give this light squared bishop a retreat square back on c2, so there's never any danger of it getting trapped on this b3 square. The next trap that we're going to look at is called the Mortimer Trap, and this is another one which black sometimes sets for white. So here, instead of playing pawn to a6, the most common move, black instead plays knight to f6 on move 3, and this is the start of the Berlin defence, a very well respected opening, and one that was made hugely popular by former world champion Vladimir Kramnik in his 2000 World Championship match against Garry Kasparov. So there are many moves for white here, but say white plays one of the quieter variations, pawn to d3. This is where black can now set a sneaky trap by playing knight to e7. Now it's not the best move here because you're moving the same piece twice in the opening and neglecting the rest of your piece development. But if white gets greedy and chops off this e5 pawn, now the trap is set. So black can play pawn to c6, and if white drops the bishop back to a4 or c4, let's say a4 in this example, then we have a very similar theme to the one we saw in our last opening traps episode, where the queen can now spring out to a5, giving a check and also hitting a knight in the centre of the board. And it's something you'll find with these traps that similar themes pop up again and again. And if white were to see this danger and instead play the knight into c4, so that if black now blundered, took the bishop and allowed knight d6 smothered checkmate, well then in response to knight c4, instead of taking that bishop straight away, instead black can simply play knight to g6, and again the bishop is still attacked and so has to move now, and the minute it drops back to a4, the only square available, black then pushes b5, and again they're winning a piece because of this pawn fork. And the final trap to be aware of in the Ruy Lopez is known as the Tarrasch Trap. So again this starts with pawn to a6, white drops the bishop back to a4, and now instead of playing pawn to d6 which we saw in the Noah's Ark Trap, black instead plays knight to f6. White now castles, and here black decides to take on e4, which is known as the open Spanish, and this used to be a big weapon of Viswanathan Anand if you want to check out some of his games. White now plays pawn to d4, black goes pawn to b5, bishop b3, d5 supporting the knight, pawn takes e5 in the centre, bishop e6 lending more support to d5, pawn to c3 controlling more central squares. Now we have bishop to e7 developing, rook to e1, black castles. White now plays the knight into d4, asking a question of this c6 knight. Now there are two key variations which black can consider here, either taking the knight on d4 or taking the pawn on e5, after which it can get very complicated after the move f3. But if black were to defend that knight, instead of going in for any of that, then this is where the trap is sprung, because white can now play knight takes e6, and after fe6, we pick up the knight on e4, and the pawn can't recapture because the black queen is pinned to that pawn. Alternatively, if instead of taking with the pawn, black were to recapture this knight with the queen, then again we can chop this knight on e4, this time because the pawn is pinned by the bishop on b3. So definitely a sneaky opening trap to look out for in the open Ruy Lopez if you do play this variation. So I hope you enjoyed these opening traps in the Ruy Lopez. Do hit that subscribe button if these videos are helping you out, and leave a comment down below for anything you'd like to see in future, and I hope to see you again on the next episode of our opening trap series.